Okay, but we're a couple of minutes early, so.
You want to test, does it actually work that? Okay.
Do I have to point it at anything?
It might be off actually. There's just a button on the side.
Yeah, on the side. Does it have batteries? I think I put batteries in it.
Oh, I think
Yeah.
here it's not.
What do I point at?
There we
There
go.
you go.
Perfect. Yeah, it works there. And then the green line is the laser.
I get to introduce you.
Okay.
Yeah?
Could everyone please sign in?
Do we have
Knowing that there are people here and the number of people that
I
are
don't think I was asked,
I
actually.
think you were. So,
Anyway, I
medical training.
was known to,
Yes.
is well known to everyone. University of Saskatchewan, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine.
Really?
Yeah,
That's cool.
yeah.
I was really excited about that 21-point lead that they have at the moment.
21-point lead in it's
On
this.
the top of the premiership. Liverpool is like,
Oh.
they're like runaway leaders. It's crazy.
Okay, no, I wasn't recruited to their, and then postgraduate training here at the U of A. Well, I've worked, well, let's skip that. Let's just say I've spent more than 7 years living and working in Africa.
Okay.
And I'm cross-appointed in the School of Public Health. And I have an emerging interest in the, well, no, never mind, that's the wrong.
We'll leave it
Say
at
one
kind of
now.
confidence.
Yeah, leave that out. Yeah, leave that out.
All right.
That's enough.
And you professor.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Just by attrition and survival.
I'll probably keep that.
Okay, so probably we have reached the moment.
All right, great. Hi, everybody, welcome. It is my great pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague, Stan Houston. We were just having a chat about Stan's path that got him here. Medical training at the University of Saskatchewan, and then training at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. And so I know we're going to want to finish this talk on time and quickly, because Liverpool will play at 1. Right? At 1. Okay. His postgraduate training here. Has spent more than 7 years living and practicing medicine in Africa. Is cross-appointed in public health, but is a professor in my home division, Division of Infectious Disease within the Department of Medicine. Further ado, thank you very much.
Okay. So if you were recruited by the poster, you might have been expecting a younger presenter. Anyway, thanks very much to Katie for talking me into doing this, and for all the work she does for the global health program in general, along with all the other stuff she does. I felt a little, I wasn't sure I should really, was a legitimate speaker for this topic. This is not an area of research interest of mine, nor in fact was I ever actually involved directly in the polio control program, but I must say it's been a topic of immense interest for a very long time, and mainly in an educational setting. And I think it is a super fascinating topic, and we're at a critical moment in history in relation to polio eradication. So that is my justification for bringing this topic today. So I have no financial disclosures, but I do have a bias, perhaps, that I am quite keen to encourage people to be aware of how dynamic and exciting the area of communicable disease is, and some people might choose to pursue these areas within the expanding range of courses that are offered in the School of Public Health, as well as for those of you who might be medical in medicine as well. Okay, so right at the moment, one of the dynamic things about communicable disease obviously is something we're in the middle of right now on the radio and the newspapers every day, with an emerging infectious disease of coronavirus that's really shaken things up around the world. And of course, that is a very exciting and unique aspect. Nobody, endocrinologists don't get new diseases, but infectious disease doctors and public health people do. But even better than having a new disease to deal with would be to actually permanently and definitively eradicate an old disease. And so that's the topic today. So is there a pointer on this too? Oh, okay. Yeah, except, of course, if I do it here, then the pointer will point to both, right? Does that work? Okay. So I think the advantages are obvious. So this would imply the complete and permanent elimination of an important disease process from humankind forever. So once again, we don't have that opportunity with any other type of disease. And not only do you reduce the burden of illness and death, but you eliminate all the costs of surveillance and control and vaccination, etc., permanently, forever, with compound interest into the future. So that's a pretty wonderful achievement, and to my mind, the most wonderful public health achievement I can even think of. So I'll just remind you briefly about our broader experience with disease eradication. In terms of human disease, we've only ever been successful once, and of course that's with smallpox, which was a hugely important disease globally, thought to have accounted for 10% of all deaths in Europe as recently as the 19th century, and prior to the initiation of the global eradication program, 4 million deaths a year, and of course a much smaller global population at that time, so much bigger impact even than HIV or tuberculosis have now. And even if you didn't die, it could leave you with disfiguring scars or disabling blindness, for example. So of course the tool, the main technical tool of eradication was the vaccine, which was developed a really long time ago. And then it was actually a Canadian who first proposed eradication. WHO embarked in 1966, and the guy who led it, some of you might be interested in, there's a book about him, this guy D.A. Henderson. He was a remarkable character, and it was a remarkable program. There were lots of bumps along the way, political and technical, that he resolved, but they eradicated smallpox on time, on budget. So heroic achievement in public health. The last wild case was in 1977. Some of you may know that there was a couple of laboratory cases in Birmingham, I think it was, where they had kept a stock of the virus, and including a death. So smallpox can only come back if we bring it back, basically. So another disease that is very close to eradication is a very different type of disease, a parasitic disease, a worm up to 1 meter long that occurs only in exotic places, now limited to the Sahel area, to just 2 countries in the Sahel area in Africa. So this is a worm being extracted from this lady's thigh, and this is a worm that has been extracted and gradually rolled out onto a matchstick, which was showed to me by one of my colleagues in South Sudan. So this has been pretty successful, almost 1 million in 1989, almost 1 million cases. Now we're getting down to in the 19 and 20 range, so really, really close. But as an instructive point, I think, is that it's not over till it's over, and we can learn new things at any stage of the process. First of all, we've always assumed that this disease was a human disease that was not a zoonosis, did not have an animal reservoir. Actually, I've learned lately that occasional cases in donkeys and dogs had been found before, but it was clearly not epidemiologically important. From an epidemiologic point of view, it was human-to-human transmission through drinking. The worm releases its eggs from a break in the skin into the water, and then actually it's picked up by a little copepod critter, and then it's ingested by drinking contaminated water. So now in Chad, it's been found that dogs are not only infected, but are contributing importantly to transmission and maintenance of the disease and risk of human transmission. So that's a whole new wrinkle that imposes new challenge on the control program. And of course, the usual challenge to every public health program, whether it's sexually transmitted infections or obesity, is human behavior. In this case, of course, the political and military instability that characterizes that part of the world has been a major challenge for the control programs. So I'm kind of interested in One Health, that is the shared issues of animal health, human health, and ecological health, and so I'm reminded that the vets have equaled our success and that they've eradicated one important disease. Rinderpest is a virus that is actually probably the origin of measles virus, FYI. And the vets, it was a really important disease for people pastoral people whose lives depended on their cattle and milk. And so they successfully eradicated by developing a heat-stable vaccine and with creative strategies for using local people to deliver the vaccine. So if eradication is such a great idea as I've suggested with all these benefits, why don't we just do it all the time with all our diseases? So in fact, the broader we, not me personally, have tried in a number of cases. So hookworm, of course, it would be easy to get rid of hookworm. All you'd need would be for everyone to have a toilet and a pair of shoes, and it would be gone. But that's what we have dismally failed to do, of course, in large parts of the world. Yaws is a bacteria that's closely related to syphilis, but not sexually transmitted. And basically, it just wasn't important enough for people to maintain a commitment to the program. But there is a simple intervention, and people are rethinking it, and we might try that again. Yellow fever is an important viral disease, and when they embarked on yellow fever eradication, they didn't realize that in fact there's an animal reservoir in monkeys, which of course will make it impossible to eradicate it. Of course, we could eliminate it. We could maintain its elimination in human populations by vaccination. Malaria, WHO, after some remarkable successes in parts of the world where the ecology is more fragile and where the populations were wealthier, like Europe and the southern US, after the Second World War, WHO thought, oh, well, let's eradicate malaria. It turns out that that's a much more complicated problem than particularly in areas like sub-Saharan Africa, where the ecology is so robust and transmission so intense. Although Bill and Melinda Gates think it might be possible. Smallpox, we said. Polio, don't worry, we're going to get there. Guinea worm, we've talked about, and rinderpest. So, polio. What's the story behind polio? I must say, when I started preparing actually for a Rotary audience, actually, and maybe this would be a good time to mention that Rotary International has embraced polio eradication for many years and has made a major contribution to this. Anyway, when I was trying to think up something useful and intelligent to say about it, I realized that the story of polio is not very, the history is not very well known or well established. It's very likely it's been around for a long time, and certainly there are, in Egyptian tombs, there are people with disabilities that might be consistent with polio, but they're not that specific, so who really knows? Outbreaks were not described until the 19th century in Northern Europe, so that sounds kind of recent. Of course, a possible, and it seems paradoxical because, of course, nowadays we think of polio as a disease of underdevelopment and poor hygiene. It may actually be that polio kind of hit the awareness as hygiene improved. And the reason is that polio is much more likely, poliovirus infection is much more likely to cause paralysis and disability if it occurs at an older age, like President Roosevelt. And if you have it when you're very young, you're much less likely to get paralytic disease. That's aside from the fact that, of course, all kinds of bad things happen to people all the time. Lots of kids died, and the infant mortality rate was high in those days, so a lot of things might have been missed. But it may be that as we improved hygiene, people were exposed to the virus at an older age, that paralysis became more common and more apparent. That's true for hepatitis A, for example, maybe Helicobacter. Anyway, it still was a pretty big deal in the mid-20th century. And it was 1988 that WHO embarked on a declaration of eradication. They were obviously pretty pumped by smallpox. So yeah, a lot of countries involved, a lot of kids involved when they started out, and their finish date at that time was the year 2000, which of course is long gone. So just to remind you what polio is, here's brace, mechanism to try and compensate for the weakness produced by polio. A tragic scene in low-income countries, disabled kids. Don't know if this child is begging, but that would be a common outcome. Franklin Delano Roosevelt got polio as an adult and was paralyzed. And of course, the iron lungs are iconic features of the polio epidemic in the 1950s, including here in Edmonton. So these were negative pressure respirators that prevented people from dying if they had bulbar paralysis and couldn't breathe. So Mark Joffe, as my colleague, has had a long time interest in this and shared this slide with me about the epidemic in 1953 here in Edmonton. And this was a really big deal. It was kind of the start of intensive care in Edmonton. A guy named Russell Taylor, a doctor named Russell Taylor, who I actually met, was still here when I was a resident, led the care program, care and treatment of people with polio at that time. So once again, it seems kind of recent. 1910 was the first recognized outbreak in Canada, then the iron lung, and then disease peaked in the 50s. So this might seem like a long time ago to you guys, but it's really pretty recent history. And from a personal point of view, I remember a girl named Maureen in my grade 3 class who had a brace from polio. And this was a disease that just terrified parents and families in the early 50s. They closed swimming pools and have all kinds of other responses to the fear of polio outbreak, because they almost always occurred in the summer. So we have to talk a little bit about biology and the epidemiology, right? So it's fecal-oral transmitted, so contaminated, probably water mostly. There's some suspicion that maybe respiratory transmission contributes, but that doesn't seem to be important. Fortunately, there does not appear to be any animal reservoirs, so we don't have to worry about that. A complication is that there are 3 different strains of polio, and immunity is not cross-protective between the 3 strains, so you have to acquire individual immunity to each of the 3 strains, although that has changed recently. As part of the polio eradication program. There are other examples of this, like dengue and rotavirus, for example. One of the good things and bad things about polio is that only about 1 in 200 people who are infected actually develop paralytic disease. So obviously that's good for the 199 people who didn't get paralyzed, but it also means that most of the infection, and therefore most of the circulating virus and most of the transmission is invisible and not readily recognizable. Luckily, long-term carriage or shedding is extremely rare. So the interventions, of course, the intervention is a vaccine. The first one was an injectable killed vaccine, the Salk vaccine, in 1955, and that was a breakthrough for sure. And we'll get to how there's a role for the injectable vaccine is now coming back. but a little later, the oral vaccine was developed. So this is an attenuated or weakened live virus vaccine. And it has several advantages. It's cheaper, and because it causes infection through the natural route, it actually generates immunity in the intestine, mucosal immunity, and that's not only probably better protection for the individual, but also it reduces the ability of people to transmit virus. Some challenges are that it requires a cold chain, so you can imagine that's tricky in places like South Sudan. It doesn't work as well in settings of low income and poor hygiene. That's also true for other oral vaccines like rotavirus vaccine, and we won't go into it. There's some speculative reasons as to why that is the case, but it is a problem that the vaccine doesn't work as well in the places that, in a sense, need it the most. Very importantly, this is, as I said, a live vaccine, and there is a risk, a very low risk, but a real risk of causing paralytic disease. And even more complicated than that, the virus can revert to virulence and cause paralytic disease, and then that virulent virus can then circulate in the community in the same way that wild virus does. So in a way, it's an iatrogenic problem we've created with our live vaccine, and we'll get to the implications and what we're going to do about that, what we are doing about that. So 1985, the Pan American Health Organization committed to polio eradication and was quite rapidly successful in the Western Hemisphere. And so WHO went on to commit to global eradication. So how would you go about that? So first of all, polio is part of the expanded program in immunization, along with diphtheria and tetanus and measles and so forth, and now pneumococcus and Haemophilus, and anyway. So obviously what we'd really like to do would be to strengthen the vaccine program in all countries, but particularly low-income countries, and then coverage of polio vaccine would be enhanced. So that's one important thing, but of course, as with perhaps all health interventions in low-income countries, we haven't reached the goals that we would like to reach. Secondly, there's a surveillance element. So surveillance for the neurologic disease, which is characterized as acute flaccid paralysis. But remembering, of course, that this is only going to pick up 1 in 200 of the potentially transmissible infections in the community. Still, it's the marker we can watch for, and in fact, it doesn't require any high-tech component. You have village-level surveillance. So if your surveillance is working, the number of cases that you report every year should not be 0, because there are other causes of this clinical presentation, like Guillain-Barré syndrome. I know that, for example, Karen Grimsrud, our former provincial medical officer of health, had done some work with WHO evaluating the acute flaccid paralysis surveillance system in Ethiopia. And then if you find a case, you want to try and collect a stool sample and culture it for virus to confirm whether it was due to polio or not. So the next thing is they supplement the vaccine, the routine vaccination, with these supplementary immunization activities. So there used to be national immunization days, and I've quoted a figure here in India. Can you just imagine this? They vaccinated 127 million kids in one day in India. So they put on a huge push to just and to just kind of boost the level of fill in the gaps perhaps left by the routine immunization program. As well as that, increasingly now, trying to get a better handle on the other 199 infected individuals, you can sample sewage and for poliovirus and find out if it's circulating in the community in that way. And lastly, you have mop-up activities. So in high-risk communities, so this might be tribal groups that migrate across the Pakistan-Afghanistan border and aren't caught by, static programs. It might be places where routine vaccine coverage has been poor. Certainly, you could trigger a supplementary activity if you're finding cases, or if you're finding a virus circulating in your sewage surveillance. This is when I was in South Sudan. I wasn't involved in polio, as I said, but this was one of their focal offices in northern Kenya directing the polio program in South Sudan. So where are we at? Well, so this is thousands, so 350,000 in 1988. So we've come a heck of a long way. You can see this very encouraging graph and this immense impact of the millions of people who have been protected against developing paralytic disease. So that sounds pretty good. But as with guinea worm, we've encountered some challenges. A biological challenge, which I've already kind of alluded to, which is the development of vaccine-derived virulent poliovirus. So this leaves us with a really tricky paradox or catch-22. Thus, the cause of this problem, circulating virulent vaccine-derived poliovirus, is our vaccine, but the best response to it is the vaccine. So if all the kids in the community were effectively vaccinated and immunized, they would not be at risk of this vaccine-derived polio any more than they would be at risk of wild polio. But it's a catch-22. So one thing they did was they dropped the type 2, so the oral polio vaccine had always consisted of the 3 viral types, imaginatively named 1, 2, and 3. And so they said, well, most of this vaccine-derived disease is type 2 from type 2 vaccine. So let's, and there isn't any more wild type 2. Let's just ditch it. But that might seem like a good idea, but as you'll see in a minute, it has some problems. Of course, another approach is to revert, as I mentioned, to the injectable vaccine, so that will provide immunity. The injectable vaccine contains antigens from all 3 types, but the live vaccine has some, practical challenges about delivery, but also it isn't quite as good. It seems like it's not quite as good, and of course it doesn't create mucosal immunity that blocks transmission. So what is happening with these circulating vaccine-derived polio vaccine outbreaks? They've increased just in 2017 to 2018, which you'll remember, is just after type 2, they switched from a 3-valent to 2-valent and dropped the type 2 virus from the oral vaccine. And so we're seeing cases not only of circulating virus, but paralytic cases, and the great majority of them are due to type 2 virus. So they're trying to come up with an oral type 2 vaccine that is less prone to this reversion, so genetically more stable. This is kind of clunky, but it's just showing some of the different countries. I'll show you on a map in a second, which I think is more helpful. So this was vaccine-derived. I don't think we really had the technology to detect it reliably back in the 1990s. There's a spike here of vaccine-derived polio, and you can see it's almost all type 2. And I'm not quite sure what was going on here in the 2000s, but now there's another spike, which we'll see in a minute. So along with playing with the components of the oral vaccine, the other element, as we're hopefully approaching eradication, is to routinely implement injectable vaccine for the reasons I've already mentioned, but with the limitations that I've alluded to. And of course, once again, the other challenge to the end game of polio eradication is once again the common challenge in public health, which is public health would be so easy if it weren't for people. So here are just a few examples of many in Nigeria in the early 2000s, and apparently this was at least partly led by religious leaders who obviously would have particular credibility in their communities. Rumors circulated that the polio virus was causing AIDS or was causing sterility. And of course, these countries, their experience with the generosity of Western countries has not always been that great historically, so they've got lots of reasons to distrust our initiatives. We've seen this just recently with the Ebola outbreak in eastern Congo. So that happened in Nigeria. In Waziristan, vaccine workers were actually targeted and killed. I think that Taliban and other religious, or no, they're not religious, whatever they are, ideologic, actually in some occasions targeted vaccine workers and made that a dangerous job. Syria is seeing circulating vaccine-derived polio because of breakdown of presumably every kind of health service in the long-running civil war. They've seen it in lots of other places. Vaccine workers killed in Balochistan, which is another province of Pakistan. But here's a story that I think everybody should know about. So how many of you who have never taken a class with me are aware of this story of this American intervention? 1, 2, 3. So, okay, good. I mean, I think it's shocking. I mean, I think every citizen should know about it, but for sure everybody in health and so I'm not blaming you. I think it illustrates a failure of some aspects of what we should be conveying in medical and public health education. But anyway, so the story was, of course, that the Americans were hot on the trail of Osama bin Laden, were obsessed with Osama bin Laden, you could say. And so one of the strategies they used was they hired this Pakistani doc to conduct some fake surveillance. So he would go around house to house in communities where they thought bin Laden might be hiding, and collect specimens. I think they were saliva specimens actually, rather than, or I'm not sure, saliva or fingerprint, blood specimens. The point was that using that, they had genetic samples, I think from family members of bin Laden, and so they would be able to tell if bin Laden or his family were living in this household. And that was the strategy, but obviously it was the gross misuse of a supposedly trusted health and public health intervention for a military and political goal. So as far as I'm concerned, it's like using your ambulance to ship AK-47s or bombing hospitals, or, I mean, and I can say that all the deans of the major schools of public health in the U.S. wrote an open letter to Obama. We should have known better, for God's sake. Making this point. It's published in the New England Journal. Right. Well, so obviously, the tragedy is that few of you guys have heard of this, but you can bet that everybody in Pakistan knows this story, and of course that further undermined the polio eradication response. So, huge reduction. We're now down to 2 countries. Nigeria was recently declared formally eradicated. 2 of the 3 types are gone. 2 and 3, only one, type 1 is left. And as I mentioned, a huge number of cases of paralysis have been prevented. This is where the action is. The yellow dots are the vaccine-derived polio, and the blue, 2 different years of wild polio, limited to Pakistan and Afghanistan. So this is, I couldn't find a similar graph for Afghanistan. This is Pakistan, but you can see, which has the greater number of cases, and you can see, you know, we were down really low numbers in 2017, 2018, and now it's shooting up. And this is only part of 2019. I'll show you some slightly more updated figures, because obviously these are rolling cumulative numbers. So in 2019, there were 29 cases of wild-type polio 1 in Afghanistan, 144 in Pakistan, which you can kind of see how the trend is going. And then here, the blue is the vaccine-derived cases, and this is this is total global numbers. So again, there's that funny peak, which I guess I should learn why that happened. But anyway, of the vaccine-derived. But this is about the point where type 2 was removed from the vaccine. And we can see, I can't say for sure that's cause and effect, but it's hard to believe it isn't related, that vaccine-derived polio cases have just gone shooting up here off the top of my graph. And then here's wild type, down to global numbers of 22, kind of like guinea worm, and now we're up to 173. So from 2017, 2018, 2019. So obviously things are going seriously awry and in the wrong direction. And there are similar findings with sewage viral surveillance showing a marked increase in numbers and spread into new areas. So what's going on? Well, I guess lots of things are going on. There's some campaign fatigue in these communities, and they, I think, understandably say, our kids are hungry, they're dying of pneumonia, and you guys just go on about polio. Why don't you provide better broad range health services? And then, of course, the spread of misinformation through both old-fashioned and modern routes of information has complicated the credibility and the trust in the program. And also there are kind of nitty-gritty management problems that they're not always doing a very good job of organization and surveillance and monitoring and so forth. So what's supposed to happen when we think it's gone? We continue monitoring. We maintain laboratory resources. We switch over only to the killed vaccine, which is already underway, and then we limit the maintenance of cultures of poliovirus to a few strictly controlled circumstances. This is what they had to do with polio, with smallpox as well, for political reasons. The Russians had to have their stock, and the West had to have their stock. So live smallpox is still kept, and presumably something like that will have to be maintained for polio. So there is, I mentioned, Rotary's always been involved now. Bill Gates and others have just announced a big boost of funding to kind of kickstart the end stage of polio eradication. So I think we have come so close that it's inconceivable to me that this is not possible. I think you could really say we've proven it's possible, but possible isn't good enough, of course. So I'll leave it to you. What do you think is going to happen, and what could we or should we do to improve the odds of success? Could just mention that there are other diseases that have been considered for eradication, of which measles would obviously be the next candidate from a technical point of view, but as everyone knows, we're going backward in a fairly big way on the measles front as well because of various obstacles to vaccination. Okay, that's really the end. So many vaccines have to be kept at a cool temperature to remain viable. So live vaccines to remain viable. So you have to have a system in place that keeps the vaccine at a cool enough temperature from Nairobi to a village in South Sudan. So you're talking about the vaccine-derived polio. Well, sure. Of course, you were taught to think about all the possible explanations for trends in numbers, and the surveillance is, we know it's imperfect and it's probably variable, but I think, and I admitted that I didn't understand that earlier peak, so I don't know why, but I think that better coverage of type 2 virus was actually happening, and that's why they thought they could get rid of the type 2 vaccine, and then not having a population that's immune to type 2 is what enables vaccine-derived type 2 to come back.
So do you know if they're considering including the type 2 again? Like, I know you said they're working on
A
making it more
better type 2
stable.
vaccine, yeah.
Do they know if there's anything, or what it is about the type 2 that makes it, or is it just chance that that's what's flipping back, or is there something about the type 2 biologically that makes it
Yeah,
more likely that?
I wouldn't be the person to answer that question, but there are differences between the three strains. Actually, type 1 is the nastiest, most virulent. And clearly, if they can create a vaccine that's more genetically stable, I don't know how they do that, but then obviously the original, whether it's the wild virus has different stability, or just the attenuated virus that Sabin produced in 1962 that was had this weakness. I don't know.
Yes, one last question.
Thanks, Anne. I might be one of the oldest in the audience, but not maybe the oldest, but I remember the scare of the 40s. I was taken out of school in May and did not go back to school probably till Thanksgiving. Fortunately, we had a cottage on Lake Huron, and it didn't have a furnace, but also it didn't have running water when things froze up. But somehow then they knew that getting out of the city was a good thing. So I'm interested in how you keep the Rotary going. I would imagine most of their current members never lived through a polio epidemic. So speeches like yours are important, but what keeps them going?
Yeah, well, civil society is obviously an incredibly important element in our world, democratic society. I guess it would be inappropriate for me to start pushing some of my other enthusiasms, but I can't speak to that. Obviously, they have a high level of intrinsic motivation, and of course, they have been rewarded by success, almost.
So do you show them this slide about, yes, we're going to put in number 2, and no, we're not going to put in number 2, or we're going to change from oral to injectable, or is that a bit confusing?
Well, I guess probably, but I don't know. Are you guys confused? But I guess you have to convey that it's complicated, that the answers aren't all black and white, and that's part of why we're running into difficulties.
I think it's important to talk about the complications also, because this is going to be the last attempt to eradicate a virus, and we have to learn from these things, right? So
Yeah.